Sergeant Jake was tired. Not just the kind of tired that comes from lack of sleep, but the kind of exhaustion that gnawed at you from the inside. He'd seen it all, war, death, and alien invasions, but nothing could prepare him for what he was about to face. The briefing had been cryptic, as usual, but the gist was clear. He was assigned to tame a new weapon, a weapon that came in the shape of a wild stallion. It was part of the government's latest top-secret project, genetically engineering war beasts to fight in the war against the alien invaders. Jake rolled his eyes. A wild stallion? He'd fought off entire alien battalions, seen his comrades torn apart by monstrosities from the stars, and now they were handing him a horse? Or, as the briefing put it, a genetically enhanced war stallion. It was all ridiculous, but Jake didn't have a choice. Orders were orders. He entered the training pen with a sigh, fully expecting to see some sort of overgrown beast with the temperament of a bull. Instead, standing in the center of the enclosure, was the creature in question, a tall, sleek stallion. The creature's coat shimmered in the artificial light, and its mane moved as though it had a life of its own. What caught Jake off guard, though, wasn't the stallion's appearance. It was the look in its eyes. It wasn't a wild, untamed look of an animal. It was something else entirely. It was aware. Too aware. "Meet Shadow," the commanding officer said, standing beside Jake. A genetic marvel. Strong, fast, and capable of tactical thinking. "We need you to control it." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You want me to control it?" he asked dryly, barely hiding his amusement. "I'm sorry, but I thought you said that was a stallion." The officer smiled, the smugness oozing from his expression. "It's not just a stallion. Shadow is designed to help us win this war. We spent years perfecting the gene sequences. Shadow is smarter than most soldiers, and we need you to make it trust you." Jake stared at the stallion, who was now staring back with a keen, almost amused expression. The beast's ears flicked, and its tail swished slowly, as though it was sizing him up. For a moment, Jake felt like he was being evaluated, not just as a soldier, but as a potential partner in whatever this was. He grimaced, feeling a strange pressure building in his chest. "Fine, I'll give it a shot," Jake muttered, already regretting the assignment. As soon as Jake took a step forward, Shadow moved, but not in the way he expected. The stallion trotted toward him, its movements fluid, almost graceful. It stopped just short of him and turned its head, locking eyes with Jake. The stallion's nostrils flared as if sniffing the air around Jake, and for a brief second, Jake thought it could smell his fear, or maybe it was just messing with him. Jake held his ground. "All right, horsey, let's see what you've got." Before Jake could react, Shadow bent its head down and snatched the training whip from the officer's hand, tossing it into the air. The officer stared mouth agape as Shadow danced around, tossing the whip like it was a toy. Jake couldn't help but snicker at the absurdity. Well, that's one way to show who's boss. "No," the officer hissed, clearly frustrated. "This is not what we expected. It's supposed to bond with you, not taunt you." "Hey," Jake replied with a grin, "I think it likes me. Maybe I'm just that irresistible." Shadow trotted circles around Jake, flicking its tail as if to say, "Catch me if you can." Jake jogged after it, trying to maintain a semblance of control. But every time he thought he had a handle on the situation, Shadow used its enhanced intellect to make him look like a fool. It dodged his every move, twisting and turning with ease, keeping just out of reach. Jake found himself laughing despite the chaos. This wasn't taming. This was a game, a very embarrassing game. He lunged forward once more, reaching out to grab the stallion's reins. But Shadow spun around. Its hooves kicking up dust, and in an instant, Jake was on the ground. The stallion had thrown him, not in a violent way, just enough to send him tumbling in the dirt. As Jake lay on his back, the stallion's hooves appeared above him, poised like it was ready to strike. Jake held his breath, heart pounding. But then, with a playful snort, Shadow danced away, leaving Jake to scramble to his feet. "You're a real piece of work, aren't you?" Jake muttered, dusting himself off. Shadow stood a few feet away, watching him with that damn knowing look. It wasn't just a horse. It was a trickster, a creature that could think, could plan, and could outsmart him at every turn. Jake's initial frustration slowly morphed into something else. Something he didn't want to admit. This stallion, this war machine, was proven to be far more complicated than he could have imagined. With a resigned sigh, Jake reached for the reins once more. This time, he wasn't going to try to control Shadow. Instead, he'd have to play it smart. It was clear that Shadow wasn't going to just follow orders like some robot. No, this stallion had its own mind, and if Jake was going to make any progress, he'd need to figure out how to work with it rather than against it. "All right, big guy," Jake muttered. "You're on my team now, and I don't know if that's the best idea, but let's see what happens next." With that, he extended his hand towards Shadow once more. This time, the stallion didn't run off. Instead, it took a cautious step forward, sniffing Jake's outstretched hand before nuzzling it gently. It was almost like it was accepting him, but there was still an unmistakable glint in its eyes, a glint that made Jake question what kind of relationship he was about to get into. He wasn't sure who was taming whom, but one thing was certain. This was going to be one hell of a ride. Jake was starting to regret ever signing up for this. He had been on the front lines of countless battles, faced more death than any soldier should, and seen horrors beyond imagination, but nothing quite like this. Shadow, the genetically engineered stallion, was proven to be the most unpredictable and frustrating force he'd ever encountered. The bastard seemed to know exactly how to push his buttons every time. The war had escalated, and Jake had been given a mission: bring Shadow into battle, use its enhanced abilities to turn the tide. But instead of being the perfect weapon the military promised, Shadow seemed more interested in playing games, leaving Jake to fend for himself. In the midst of a crucial strike, Jake had tried to lead Shadow into a combat situation, expecting the stallion to charge forward and wreak havoc on the alien forces. Instead, Shadow had turned it into a chaotic dance of illusions and distractions, leading Jake to question how much control he really had. Shadow had a way of messing with the enemy, but it wasn't exactly battle tactics. More like psychological warfare at its finest. The first time they faced off against a group of alien invaders, Shadow created a dozen mirages of itself, each galloping in different directions. The aliens, confused by the sight, fired wildly into phantoms while Shadow slipped behind their lines and knocked them out one by one. It was more absurd than effective, but somehow it worked. Jake wasn't sure if he should be proud or pissed off. Shadow was a nightmare command. Every time Jake tried to issue a direct order, Shadow ignored him and did whatever it pleased. At first, Jake thought it was an act of rebellion, but he soon realized that the stallion was much smarter than anyone had given it credit for. Shadow wasn't ignoring him. It was testing him. Shadow wanted to see how far Jake would push before breaking. But Jake had been through worse. He wasn't about to let some overgrown horse ruin his reputation. He started to figure out a strategy, one that involved working with Shadow rather than trying to tame it. He figured out that the stallion didn't respond to force or commands. It responded to trust. Shadow would only follow when it knew Jake wasn't trying to dominate it, but when he trusted it in return. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't fast. But eventually, Jake started to see the benefits of their bizarre partnership. One night, as they prepared for another assault on the alien fleet, Jake tried something new. Instead of forcing Shadow into battle plan, he let the stallion decide the approach. Shadow, as usual, did something completely unexpected. Instead of charging headfirst into the enemy's defense, it slipped into the shadows, its powerful legs barely making a sound. Jake was about to order it to charge when he saw the gleam in the stallion's eyes. He could sense the creature was on the move. Jake hesitated, watching as Shadow moved like a phantom. He trusted the stallion's instincts now, and for the first time he realized how much more effective they could be as a team if they stopped fighting each other. Shadow took down aliens with precision, slipping through their ranks without them even realizing it. It wasn't just about brute strength. Shadow had an innate understanding of tactics that Jake couldn't even begin to explain. In the middle of the mission, Jake was confronted by an alien general, an enormous, armored brute who had been causing chaos for the human forces. Jake took aim, but Shadow was already in motion, bounding over his head and tackling the alien before Jake could get off a single shot. It was reckless, sure, but it was effective. Shadow wasn't waiting for orders anymore. It was taking charge, saving Jake's life without hesitation. The general's armored body hit the ground with a resounding crash, and Jake could hear Shadow's triumphant snort as it danced around the fallen alien. Jake stood there, speechless, watching Shadow's playful antics in the middle of a battle. It was absurd, but the stallion was saving lives and winning battles. Jake hadn't signed up to babysit a genetically enhanced horse, but maybe that's what he was doing now. He wasn't sure if he should be annoyed or impressed, so he just let it slide. You know, Jake muttered under his breath, his weapon still trained on the enemy, "You're making me look bad." Shadow snorted, probably in response to some inner joke only it understood, and jogged back to Jake's side. Its tail flicked as if it were saying, "Yeah, well, you're welcome." The rest of the battle was a blur. Shadow made it look easy. It used its powers to manipulate the terrain, creating shields and barriers that threw the enemy off balance. It was like a dance, a strange ballet of combat, and Jake had to admit this was something special. Shadow wasn't just a weapon. It was an extension of his own will, but with a mind of its own. And damn if that didn't make everything more complicated. As the battle ended and the alien forces retreated, Jake found himself standing beside Shadow, both of them covered in the grime of war. He hadn't planned on bonding with a genetically engineered warhorse, but here he was, staring at the creature that had just single-handedly turned the tide of a battle. They hadn't won the war, not yet, but this was a good start. Jake took a deep breath, wiping the sweat off his brow. "All right, you win," he muttered, barely able to suppress a grin. "You're not as terrible as I thought." Shadow seemed to wink at him, probably not literally, but the effect was the same. It was as if the stallion was telling him, "I know more than you think." Jake laughed, shaking his head. "Yeah, I'm sure you do." For the first time, Jake didn't feel like he was taming a beast. Instead, he felt like he was part of something bigger, something unexpected. He wasn't sure where this bond was going, but he wasn't about to fight it. As he clapped Shadow on the shoulder, feeling more camaraderie than he ever thought he would with an animal, he realized that maybe, just maybe, they were starting to figure each other out, and if that meant fighting a war together, then Jake was ready for whatever came next. Jake had always prided himself on being a soldier. He'd seen it all, alien armies, devastating battles, and the kind of carnage that would leave most men broken. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the chaos that was Shadow, the genetically engineered stallion. The damn creature had a mind of its own, and Jake was starting to realize just how much trouble that could cause. After their recent successes, Jake had started to believe that Shadow wasn't just an unpredictable war machine. No, this beast, this stallion, was something else. Shadow wasn't just a tool in the fight against the alien invaders. It was a partner, and for better or worse, Jake was stuck with it. The military had been impressed by Shadow's combat prowess, especially in the last battle, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being led around by the reins, metaphorically, of course. Shadow was always one step ahead of him, and it wasn't like the stallion was shy about letting Jake know it. Whenever Jake tried to assert control, Shadow simply laughed it off, using its powers to turn the situation in its favor. It was a game, and Jake was the one constantly playing catch-up. But something was different now. It wasn't just the tactics that had shifted. It was the bond they were forming. Jake wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere between dodging alien fire and Shadow turning enemy tanks into piles of rubber chickens, he'd started to care about the damn thing. It wasn't just about controlling Shadow anymore. It was about understanding it. And that's when it happened. The mission was supposed to be a routine raid. In and out, wipe out a few alien nests, collect some intel, and get back to base. Simple, right? Except it wasn't. Nothing ever was. Jake and Shadow were deep behind enemy lines when they encountered a new kind of alien, a hulking brute, nearly 8 feet tall, with thick armor and a weapon that looked like it could vaporize an entire platoon. The thing was a monster, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before they were overrun. Shadow had been itching for a fight, but Jake wasn't so sure. The stallion's playful antics had worked in small skirmishes, but this was different. They were outgunned and outmanned. "Stay close," Jake muttered to Shadow, trying to mask the tension in his voice. Shadow simply snorted, its eyes gleaming with excitement. The stallion wasn't afraid. It was eager, like it had been waiting for this moment. Jake couldn't help but feel the same surge of adrenaline, despite the overwhelming odds. Shadow's antics had always been a distraction, but now, in this moment, Jake realized something. The stallion wasn't just playing, it was thinking. It was doing something he hadn't anticipated. The stallion wasn't relying on brute force. It was using its intellect, and that made it terrifying. The alien brute charged forward, its massive weapon raised. Jake fired a shot, but the blast barely fazed the creature. Shadow, however, moved like a ghost, darting around the alien's flank, using its powers to manipulate gravity. The alien's feet suddenly felt like lead, and it stumbled, struggling to regain balance. Jake took the opportunity to fire again, this time landing a solid hit. The alien roared in pain, but it wasn't done yet. It lunged at Jake, swinging its weapon like an axe. Jake barely ducked in time. And that's when Shadow did something that made Jake stop dead in his tracks. The stallion, using its telekinetic abilities, wrapped the alien in an invisible force, lifting it off the ground and slamming it into the nearby wall. The alien hit the ground with a sickening thud, unconscious. Jake blinked. He'd never seen anything like it. Shadow hadn't just used brute force, it had thought, planned, and executed a strategy with precision. It was as if the stallion had learned from every battle, every encounter. It wasn't just an animal. It was a damn war strategist. "Holy shit," Jake muttered, staring at the now motionless alien. He glanced over at Shadow, who was watching him with that same mischievous glint in its eyes. "You did that on purpose, didn't you?" Shadow snorted again, as if to say, "Of course I did, genius." Jake let out a chuckle. Despite the danger they were still in, "You're starting to impress me, buddy. Maybe I should stop trying to fight you and just follow your lead." As the alien nest came into view, Jake realized something else. Their bond had shifted. This wasn't just about following orders anymore. Shadow wasn't some errant beast to be tamed. It was a living, thinking entity with its own goals, its own purpose. And somehow, it seemed like their fates were intertwined. They made their way deeper into the alien stronghold, using Shadow's powers to evade detection. The stallion's ability to manipulate shadows and alter their surroundings made them nearly invisible. Jake had no idea how it worked, but he didn't care. All that mattered was that Shadow was pulling its weight. The further they went, the more Jake realized that he had underestimated this creature. Shadow wasn't just his partner in combat. It was his partner in survival. Without Shadow, Jake would have been dead several times over. It wasn't just the stallion's powers that kept him alive. It was its mind, its ability to think outside the box, to anticipate danger, to strategize in ways that no human soldier could. In the thick of battle, while enemies rained fire from above, Jake felt something he hadn't expected. Trust. He trusted Shadow. He wasn't just relying on the stallion to get him through this mission. He was relying on its judgment. And for the first time in this war, Jake felt a sense of camaraderie that went beyond rank or species. This wasn't just about military strategy. It was about partnership. The mission ended in success, with Shadow once again turning the tide in their favor. As the last of the alien forces retreated, Jake felt a strange sense of pride. It wasn't because they had won. It was because for the first time he felt like he and Shadow had truly won together. As they made their way back to base, Jake looked at the stallion. It wasn't just a war machine anymore. It was a friend, however strange that might be, and as ridiculous as it seemed. He couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, they were more alike than he'd ever thought. After all, Shadow was the one creature who understood what it meant to be stuck in a war you couldn't control. As they reached their base, Jake chuckled to himself. "I guess you're not so bad after all," he said, reaching out to pat Shadow's neck. The stallion flicked its tail and snorted, as if it were saying, "Damn right, I'm not." Jake laughed, and for the first time in ages, he felt like he might just survive this war after all. Jake had been through a lot. The war, the aliens, the near-death encounters. But none of it had been quite as strange as his current situation. Shadow, the genetically engineered stallion, had gone from being a chaotic, unpredictable nuisance to a full-fledged war hero. The stallion had saved his life more times than Jake could count. But Jake was starting to realize that the war wasn't the only thing they were fighting anymore. The bond between them had shifted. What was once an uneasy partnership was now something far more complicated. The alien forces had retreated temporarily, and the humans were taking the opportunity to regroup. Jake and Shadow were tasked with leading a special operation to infiltrate an alien supply base and gather critical intel. Normally, Jake would have been all business, but with Shadow by his side, things had become strange. The Stallion's playful antics had evolved into something else, a kind of understanding between them. Shadow wasn't just playing tricks anymore. There was something deeper, something Jake wasn't sure how to handle. They were deep behind enemy lines when things went sideways. They had infiltrated the alien base with ease, Shadow using its powers to cloak their presence and confuse the enemy. For a while, it felt almost too easy. Then, in a split second, everything changed. A horde of alien warriors emerged from the shadows, and Jake barely had time to react before they were surrounded. Damn it! Jake cursed under his breath, drawing his weapon. He wasn't afraid. He'd face worse, but the odds were stacked against him. He could hear the rumble of alien footsteps closing in. Shadow's eyes locked with his, and for the first time, Jake saw something other than mischief in the Stallion's gaze. There was a moment of complete understanding between them, a silent agreement. This was it. The alien forces closed in, their weapons aimed at Jake and Shadow. But before they could fire, the Stallion moved. It wasn't the playful trickster from before. This time, Shadow was all business. With a snort, it charged into the fray, its hooves pounding the ground like thunder. The alien warriors tried to react, but Shadow was faster. Using its powers, the Stallion bent the fabric of space, sending aliens flying in every direction. It was chaos, controlled chaos. Jake fired into confusion, taking down a few of the invaders, but his focus was split. He couldn't keep up with Shadow. The Stallion was everywhere, moving with such precision and speed that Jake was left in awe. He realized in that moment that this wasn't just a creature. It was a weapon, an intelligent, calculating weapon with the mind of a soldier. As the last of the alien forces fell, Shadow stopped in the center of the battlefield, standing tall and proud. It was a sight to behold. This creature that had once been a source of frustration was now their greatest ally. Jake stood frozen, his breath ragged from the intensity of the fight. He had never seen anything like it. Shadow had just taken down an entire battalion of aliens, and Jake hadn't even had to lift a finger. "Well," Jake said, his voice rough from adrenaline, "I guess you're not just a pretty face, huh?" Shadow flicked its tail, as if to say, "Damn right." Jake couldn't help but laugh, the tension finally breaking. But as he looked at the Stallion, he felt a strange shift in his chest, a realization that he hadn't expected. Shadow wasn't just a partner in battle anymore. The bond between them had deepened, and Jake couldn't ignore it. Shadow was more than just a war machine. It was something he could rely on, something that understood him in a way no one else could. The realization hit Jake like a ton of bricks. He had started this journey thinking of Shadow as nothing more than a tool, another weapon to be used. But over time, he had come to understand that Shadow was more than that. It wasn't just about the battles or the war anymore. It was about the connection they had formed. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about living, about fighting alongside someone who had become more than just an ally. They made their way back to base. The mission of success. Shadow walked beside him, its steps confident and steady, as though it knew exactly what it had accomplished. Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Pride not just in their success, but in the bond they had forged. The war was far from over. The alien forces were still a threat, and there were countless battles ahead. But as they walked through the gates of the base, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The kind of hope that comes when you realize you're not alone in this fight. Jake glanced over at Shadow, who was trotting beside him with a glint of mischief in its eyes. "You know," Jake said with a smirk, "I used to think this whole thing was a joke. But now I think we got a chance." Shadow snorted, as if to say, "Damn right we do." Jake chuckled and patted the Stallion's neck. "All right, let's get some rest. We got a long road ahead." As they made their way to the barracks, Jake couldn't help but feel that, no matter what happened next, they were ready for it. Shadow had proven itself in ways Jake never could have imagined, and now For the first time, Jake felt like they were truly in this together. This war, this bond. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about fighting together, side by side, no matter what came next. And as Jake drifted off to sleep that night, the last thought in his mind was that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore.